So Dr. Krishna is a friend of mine, and he is an excellent researcher, a scientist, an endocrinologist, wears many hats, and he has a wonderful holistic view of a lot of issues in endocrinology. And he's going to give us an overview of obesity in 2023. Dr. Krishna, over to you. Is Dr. Krishna here? I had seen him just now. Oh, he's not able to unmute. Dr. Krishna, can you just, rejoin? Can you just leave the meeting and rejoin? Maybe you'll be able to manage.
I've unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, screen. What's showing on your screen?
First slide is showing obesity.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. First, let me apologize that I will have to leave at 7:55 or 57, simply because I goofed and agreed to another oration today, a medical education oration. But when Dr. Sangram Biradar calls and Neeta is there, I can't say no. So, and Dr. when I said I'll do a specific topic, Dr. Sangram wanted me to do a overview. So I've been interested in this from 1997. When I took my boards in 1997, there were hardly 5 to 7% of 5 to 10% of questions on obesity. Today, 30 years later, I'm sure I've taken 2 more boards, and the majority of questions are on obesity and diabetes. And so what I thought is I'll start off from that time and work through 8 things. I won't bore you too much, just a different sample, and then you can have a big discussion on this. The first thing is, my big interest was this particular chart. This showed the prevalence of obesity in 1991. And I remember till 2008, every year I was adding this US data to show what was happening. In 1991, if you notice that some of these cases, states in the southern part of the US had about 10 to 14% obesity. And you would notice that 10 years later, they had the same incidence of diabetes. Now, fast forward to 2021, and there are a few states that have 45 to 50% obesity, and the rest of it were 35 to 40% over. You will see that there's not a single blue in the whole country. So this is how my interest started. Worldwide, this is the same, and you're noticing that by 2015, you're seeing both in Asia and other countries, and we had a very beautiful comment by the chairman here about obesity in islands, right? This is the obesity forecast for 2040. You're looking at a 30% of obesity in men and overweight, and about 25% approximately by 2040. So we all know that obesity increases the risk of complications. It's important to understand it's the most important forerunner of diabetes. And many of us have now started believing that the primary therapy of diabetes has to be through obesity, and that'll be through one of the studies that I'll show you quickly as we go on. So the blues have become reds. The problem has remained higher, children especially. Let me talk a minute about where is genetic obesity. 10 years ago, this was very, very important. We hear very less about it, but I think it's important to understand it because a lot of coming therapies are going to be because of genetic therapies. Remember that obesity is a disease basically at the hypothalamus, where the body is not able to match the inputs and the outputs. And at some point of time, there is a mismatch between what you take in and what you store, right? And I've done many talks on this. Today is a sampler, I'm stopping there. But it's important to understand the difference between monogenic versus polygenic obesity. Monogenic obesity is early, severe, high genetic contribution, usually a single mutation. Large genetic effect, it's rare, it has high penetrance, there's really no environmental influence. The obesity that we have may have a modest genetic contribution. If present, there are 100 variants of nearly many genes. Each variant only has a small effect. It's very common. It has low penetrance, but environment is a key determinant. These are the monogenic obesities that we know of. And as late as 2018, we've had discovery of single genes. In the meantime, the GWAS has occurred that has showed almost about 1,200 genome associations through the GWAS. This, of course, is leptin deficiency, which we know was discovered, the first to be discovered. And of course, it's one of the few obesities where actually recombinant leptin treats obesity. The rest of us are leptin resistant, and therefore we are not. But some of these monogenic causes of obesity are important because the functional of these genes gives us new clues of how to take care of other obesity. And I've just highlighted the ones that are involved in treatment of regular obesity. For example, the MC4R, the melanocortin 4 receptor, there are drugs that are used for this particular form of obesity that are now in trials for garden variety obesity. Similarly, the POMC or the pro-opiomelanocortin. For example, Prader-Willi syndrome, we use oxytocin now for many of the symptoms, and it's something that can be used in other conditions. The environment, however, is the most important part, and now people have talked about sitting as a new smoking. One of the things that we know is that our gut microflora determine obesity to a large extent. There is a relationship between the gut microflora and the brain, and this is called the gut brain axis. And in fact, one of the very interesting treatments that people have talked about is fecal transplantation in the very obese. Doesn't work too well, but that's been used. But ultimately, it's a toxic environment. Moving away from who we are, eating foods that our ancestors did not eat, fast food, processed food especially. I think there is more and more and more data that processed food is the killer. And of course, sugar greater than four servings per week, high incidence of obesity, and of course, we know the story of the sugar lobby. But remember that anytime you touch a can of Coke, that's 39.8 grams of sugar, about 27.5 in Red Bull. So be careful. And of course, if they tell you just for a few pennies more, you can get a little more of the drink, it actually increases the number of calories. So, and of course, young people are the most important. I'm not doing a pediatric talk, but remember that they actually have a lot of calories from saturated fat. Of course, the fitness bit, I won't go into it in depth today, but remember that we are people who take escalators to the gym. But the question is sitting the new smoking? And this is something that people are talking about over and over and over again about sitting being the new smoking. The answer is sitting is probably not smoking, and this data shows that not really, but it's important not to be sedentary. I want to talk about something that people have talked about in the past, which is the metabolic healthy obesity. Is there anything that is metabolically healthy? So remember that we have decreased fitness, chronic positive energy balance, genetic size. Ultimately, there is adipocyte, there's ectopic fat. When the fat becomes inflamed, that's when the complications occurs. But there's a small amount of patients who do not have complications, in whom the fat is present, the adipose tissue has hyperplastic, there's normal angiogenesis, the fat is stored in subcutaneous rather than in visceral. There are protective signals like adiponectin that are present. This is metabolically healthy obesity. But interestingly, this can be a transition. The majority of us have metabolically unhealthy obesity. There's adipocyte hypertrophy. The adipocyte undergoes insulin resistance. There is inflammation. And this slide, I have shown it for years and years from Suganami, that shows that there is a jugalbandi in the abdomen that causes both inflammation and lipokine production. The fat becomes ectopic, there's insulin resistance, then there is diabetes, NASH, and heart disease. But what is interesting is to see that this group that is metabolically healthy, that where fat acts as a sink, but here the metabolically unhealthy. But what is important to understand is that even in patients who are metabolically healthy, you will notice that the incidence of type 2 diabetes is not the same as someone who's lean. The incidence of cerebrovascular disease or heart failure is not the same as someone who is lean. So really that even the metabolically healthy people need to be targeted, even though they may not have the consequences immediately. But what is important to understand is metabolic health and unhealthy are transient. Here is the example of somebody who was metabolically unhealthy, who was treated, became metabolically healthy, the treatment was interrupted, then again became metabolically unhealthy, and finally had bariatric surgery and became healthy. So it's a transition that goes on back and forth, And the idea is to keep this patient, even if a little obese, in a metabolically healthy space. When it comes to that, here is the big news. And I'm going to just quote one study today that shows that caloric restriction causes weight loss and also reversal of diabetes. The direct study, and remember, this was done in primary care, not in an endocrinologist's office or a bariatric surgeon's office, that showed that up to 86% of patients who had about 15 kilograms of remission of weight loss at remission. These are people who were in primary care practices. They were put onto 800 calorie diets. Their diet was replaced, then food was naturally replaced, and they actually showed remission of diabetes. And this is why there is a shift from anything else to obesity as the primary target in diabetes, and showing that at the end of year two, the intervention group had a greater incidence of remission. Whether Neeta is there and she's an expert on this, I'm somebody who sticks my neck out and says that whether it is intermittent fasting, whether it's time restricted meals, these all help. Changing macronutrient content without reducing calories does not work. But here is data to show that calorie restriction actually works if it is done. You've had a great talk on bariatric surgery. I'm just going to tell you one thing. It works, and it works for a long period of time. This data is excessive weight loss, but you'll notice all these procedures at the end of 8 to 10 years still have considerable weight loss. So metabolic surgery is going to stay for some time. But medical therapies are catching up. That brings me to the last two parts of my talk. The first thing is the current medical therapies all bring down the glucose by about 5 to 10, 5% to 7%, right? Even up to liraglutide. That's it. But here is the kicker. Currently, we are looking at drugs that bring down the weight by up to 10 to 15%. And in the pipeline, drugs that will bring down as much as bariatric surgery. The idea is to complement bariatric surgery. Some of us endocrinologists think it is to replace, but I think it's to complement bariatric surgery. The first strategy is to increase the dose of GLP-1 RA. This is the Award 11 study. Dulaglutide of 4.5 milligrams increases the weight loss by up to 4.5. When semaglutide's weight is increased, this is 2.4 milligrams per week, you would see there is a 16% weight loss in the sema group in the step one study. So this is great stuff, right? But look at the pipeline. The pipeline is actually looking at a lot more stuff. Interesting ones, the glutides, the twin cretins. Look at this thing called setmelanotide. This is what I talked about when I talked about MC4R agonism, right? Then FGF21, leptin analogs, and the cannabinoid receptors, which we gave up some time ago, are all coming back. This is an example of how combinations work. This is Cargisema, which is amylin 833 plus semaglutide, 17.1% weight loss. Amazing stuff. But what is going to be the molecules of the future are the coagonists. That is two drugs or three drugs into a single molecule. This is the GLP-1 glucagon coagonist, the GLP-1 GIP coagonist. This is a triagonist. They can be a chimera where they just added onto it, or they can be fusion where they just linked up to it, right? The example that is often quoted is tirzepatide, almost entering the market, has a body weight of about 11.3 kgs, and the percentage of patients who reach a greater than 15% weight loss at 15 milligrams of tirzepatide is almost 24%. That's bariatric surgery levels. But what is in the future? This is looking at the twin cretins. They are addressing the brain, the brown adipose tissue, the thermogenesis, the stomach. But what we really want is weight loss of 20 to 25%. And that's where these novel therapies are going to come in. Some, like tesofenacin, that's looking at the central nervous system, the cannabinoids. Remember, we had rimonabant that's coming back in a different name. Leptin analogs are coming, more and more dual and combined agonists, FG21 analogs. Interestingly, the skeletal muscle is bimagrumab. And I'm going to spend 1 minute on something that I love, and that is looking at brown fat. So brown fat is something that we all have, which is called baby fat. What we realized in the 90s and the 2000s was that when you took a bath in the Arctic Ocean, or you were stuck in a refrigerator, You're exposed to cold, the brown fat renews. Today we know that brown fat increases burning of fat and reduces obesity, right? But we have white fat. How can we express brown fat? And it seems to be that there are many ways to do this. One is cold. The other is taking capsaicin, chili, the kind of things that we eat at home. The third, of course, is is some drugs that I will talk about. So you could use curcumin and capsaicin, you could use resveratrol, you could use ginger, and add these things to your diet, and that actually increases thermogenic heat and weight loss. But what is interesting is this new drug called mirabegron. This is a B3 receptor agonist and beta 3 receptor agonist. And what it does is it increases the expression of this particular protein called UCP1. UCP1 works at the level of the mitochondria, increases ATP production, and therefore dissipates heat. So the white fat can be browned by this particular drug. Similarly, thyroid receptor agonists can do the same thing. So it's an exciting time for us to be in obesity. The problems remain, they increase, but there is also a lot of data to show that we are at the best time ever. Thus, this decade is going to be the decade where obesity is going to be combated and this thing. Just before I close, I also want you to remember that for Asians, we are all too smaller. That is, we are overweight at 23, we are obese at 28, and probably we have comorbidity at 33. So with this, I'm going to stop. I hope you got it, Sarona Bhavan, different sampler. I ran through the whole gamut of obesity. I still have about 4 minutes, 3 minutes where you can 3 to 4 minutes where you can